This podcast is made possible in part by the generous contribution of our Smart Insiders Plus members. If you're not a member, join in now. Just go to smartrecovery.org/insiders.
Welcome to the Smart Recovery Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Frazier. Today on the podcast, my guest is Mercy Bell. She is co-owner of Sober Voices, an organization whose mission is to amplify and celebrate all voices and all experiences on the journey of recovery and mental health. Sober Voices has a particular interest in working with young adults, many of whom are college students. Mercy Bell, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Luke.
You know, I'd like to start by learning a little more about you, your personal background, and some of your professional experience. And, we'll get into how that led to Sober Voices.
Certainly. Well, I could go pretty far back, but I think the right place to begin is probably with my experiences as a young person in college, which I think in many ways helped both myself and my co-founder, Alyssa, create a path forward for Sober Voices and for sourcing voices, which I know we'll get into. I went to a high achieving sort of academic institution from middle school to high school, and then all the way to college. And I had landed at Stanford, and this was supposed to be the big moment where everything was coming together. And on the outside, things looked really good. But internally, I was having that experience that I think is actually common for a lot of young people, whether they find themselves dealing with substance use or anything, which is that even though the outsides all checked the boxes, the insides didn't. I felt mostly ill at ease with my surroundings, uncomfortable around people, but pretty good at hiding it. One of those extroverts masking their introversion. Mm-hmm. And it was my experience that, like, when I drank in a college setting, and if anyone's been on a college campus, that is the setting, a lot of that internal discomfort disappeared. And so I found myself really relying on substances to feel like I could make the outside match the inside. And as a result, found myself after college in a situation where it was really a recovery or else. I always say, like, there are people who have these really deep bottoms where everyone in their life can identify it and kind of hope they can pull themselves out of it. I had a bottom that most people couldn't see, still achieving, outside still looking okay. But I certainly don't think I'd be here had I not, found a path to recovery.
Yeah. Well, I've certainly heard the situation you're describing before, that kind of being ill at ease, yet still from the outside view, achieving, being, someone who, quote unquote, has their stuff together. And that can be dangerous. And I know in my own life, I share that kind of trait of being able to look good, but really not feeling it on the inside, feeling that discomfort or feeling the less than kind of perspective when I compared myself, which is a dangerous thing to do, regardless of who you are, whether you're in college or elsewhere. So I really can relate to that. And so what happened as far as, like, you found yourself at this bottom, and it was a high bottom, as sometimes is said. What happened next?
Well, this was during the age where I hadn't heard much about any acronyms as far as recovery goes. So, I didn't understand quite yet that there would be many pathways to recovery open to me. At 26, I took myself into the 12-step, path and found a lot of support and a lot of community. I went down the yoga path, and found a lot of support in community. The meditation path, I found a lot of support in community. Therapy, there was a lot of trends of finding these little circles and pockets of people where they could, really say my story and then give me tools. And it felt like I was collecting this giant toolkit. And ultimately, after call it 4 or 5 years of continuous, sobriety, recovery, however we define it, I found myself back home, moving back from California to Boston. And I had been working the way I had been drinking. So meaning I had a bottom that had nothing to do with substances, but that was just about my own stress levels and my own burnout. And that's when I serendipitously came across, Alyssa and a friend of hers who were working on creating a digital event for sober people.
Mm-hmm. hmm And that I heard the little bit of, let's say, amusement when you were talking about these different pathways, and you were a seeker. You were a seeker looking for those communities and looking for
Definitely.
what was helping with, some of the distress you may have been under, or some of that, sense of not being who you really appear to be. Is that fair to say that you were a seeker and kind of looking all
Yeah.
over the place?
I think seekers sounds way more like interesting and esoteric. What I sometimes say is like, I'm just like a buffet grazer. Like if you put me at the buffet, like I'm not sticking with just the carrot sticks. I might have one, to cleanse my palate, but I'm going over the buffalo wings, or then I'm going over to the salad bar. So that's how I think about recovery. I would never ask someone to just eat carrot sticks every day. So like, I'm trying to, at least in my own recovery model, what I hope is available for everyone else. Many, many different ways to, improve the quality of my life and my perspective, of which one might be this thing over here. And there's probably 6 or 7 other modalities and communities that I can be a part of at the same time.
Right. Right. Well, that is, speaks highly of someone who is keeping their eyes open, being willing to look at different things, to look at all parts of the buffet until you make selections, and not being afraid to get a little bit of this, return to your seat, and then go back to the buffet and see what else you may have missed.
Yes.
So
occasionally get food poisoning at the buffet and say, I'm never going to try that again.
Okay. Yeah, well, depending where you are, I could understand that.
Yeah.
So you meet Alyssa Hart, and she is someone who is also interested in recovery. And I imagine that because she was in the midst of putting together a sober event, that interested you or made you think, maybe I want to be involved in this.
It did. I mean, I was so impressed with what Alyssa and her friend were up to, because there was something really novel about using Instagram, which was the primary source where they were kind of gathering an audience, and then using, essentially event software, which would just come into being because of the pandemic. Seeing that combination of technology and sort of like ecosystem being used for recovery, like I hadn't really seen that yet. Or if I'd seen it, it had been from the more institutional voices, more traditional recovery organizations. But here were these just like, 2 women making it happen, grassroots style. And I said, I think there's really something here. I attended the first event right in the heart of the pandemic. Such a swelling of engagement around all of these speakers who had such different perspectives on topics related to recovery and sobriety. And this third topic we call sober curiosity, meaning like there were people there speaking who may or may not have taken an abstinence only approach, or even be in a moment of complete abstinence. So lots and lots of different perspectives.
Yeah. So people were where they were. And that didn't mean
exactly.
that everyone was, following a program that specifically said that abstinence is the only goal.
Right.
And follow maybe a very structured program, as opposed to looking at different ways, multiple ways, multiple pathways. So was that then the inspiration that you and Alyssa had about starting Sober Voices? And at this point, if you can distinguish between Sober Voices and Sourcing Voices.
Yeah. So I really have to credit Alyssa, in her partnership with her friend in creating this brand of Sober Voices, Instagram-based community with online in-person events, right? This idea of like just having this community that exists mostly in social for people across the world, young people in particular, with a strong focus on, the voices of the LGBTQIA community, of the BIPOC community, the neurodivergent community. And what Alyssa and I decided to do after the first initial test run of this Sober Voices concept was to do it again and quite literally double it. 80 speakers, and then
So
creating.
the second year, I mean, you just had a modest goal of doubling the speakers and doubling the size.
Yeah, 40 is enough. I mean, we really did not have to double. But the idea was that we heard what made folks feel so amazing when they came to this event was being seen and heard in other people's stories that they didn't typically hear in other spaces where they could, get into community. And so we said, well, why not just double it in an effort to share even more perspectives so that even more people could come and hear stories that they relate to.
Right.
And to your question about, differentiating between sober voices and sourcing voices has become this technology platform that Alyssa and I have built. So events are ephemeral. You show up, you enjoy yourself, you get connected, you feel good, and then usually life happens again. And especially for younger individuals, I'm thinking about for those of us who are like moving and life changes, can be really hard to stay grounded in community. So we thought, well, if we could build a home where all the content lived, all the stories, the panels, the discussions, all of this amazing wisdom and like just vulnerable storytelling from individuals, can we put it somewhere? So we did. We created a site, sourcingvoices.com, and now that kind of, I guess it's another event, but it's always on and you're always welcome, is available to students in particular. We partner with colleges and universities mostly on getting this content to them.
Yeah. Well, you said two very important things. You talked about the diversity of voices, the ways that people can relate to someone who is similar or has some similar characteristics and the communities you mentioned. So, I mean, how key is that to making sure that people can relate? We relate to things that make sense to our own experience. So that really you put out there initially and strongly. Is that such a foundational principle for sober voices and sourcing voices?
It truly is. We could take it from every angle. From the emotional level, I don't think there's a single person on the planet who doesn't kind of have that personal experience of whether you're watching a movie or show or reading a book and identifying with the character and that creating a totally different experience of the story. So if part of us, healing on a journey around addiction is connection, that connection relies upon hearing stories that are similar to mine. It's just like that to me, that's it. The other part is like, I'm sure scientific. If we looked at the brains of human beings as they hear stories they can relate to, the neural links of like, oh, connecting this back to my experience. Oh, that me too. We have an opportunity to sort of hack our brains, and the more the truth can seep into my brain, at least I'll speak for myself. I need to hear stories that are just like mine so I don't forget, which is the scariest part to me of the whole recovery thing, is that it's been so long since I've had a drink or drug in my hand. And yet I can tell you there are days I wake up, it's just like, I can't even connect to that experience that governed my life for years. I forget. And then I come into one of my communities and someone tells a story and it like rockets me back to that moment when I felt that low. And by keeping it in the forefront of my brain that I have community, but I'm also, yes, I'm in recovery. That keeps me, I think, partially very safe in my program and in my, in my stable, happy place. So hugely important.
That's Mercy Bell. She is our guest today on the Smart Recovery Podcast. We're talking about sober voices and sourcing voices. And sober voices specifically deals with college students, and not exclusively, but certainly has an emphasis on meeting young people where they are. I like what you said about voices, really, stories when they are similar to ours, really is reinforced in a neuroscientific context. And we can really relate, and we can really make sure that, as you said, it's kind of an ingrained memory that we hear a story. And I guess we could even dial out to this idea that when you see a good movie or read a good book, when you have things that you can relate to, either emotionally or in some specific kind of situation, then it makes more sense and you feel more deeply that story. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Absolutely, Luke, you're hitting it on the head. And I think the other aspect of relating to a story, at least for me, is knowing that the author isn't trying to get me somewhere. You think about the best movies in the world. It's like, I don't know what's going to happen in the plot, or I don't feel like they're making me feel this way. The emotions are rising up naturally. And so the second part isn't just that the stories are similar to mine. It's that we're telling them without trying to get folks to believe us or believe our way is the way. Every single speaker who comes onto the Sober Voices or Sourcing Voices platform. So whether it's an event for Sober Voices or they're on the actual platform telling their story, digitally, it's just about them sharing their experience. There is no agenda here.
I was just going to say that if there's a lack of agenda, and people can tell. I mean, you're perceptive. You can tell when someone is just trying to really get you to think something or feel something, and that it's their agenda rather than just offering it as their story.
Absolutely.
So you were inspired by Alyssa and inspired, by some of the things that you felt and heard. Let's go right into the mission of Sober Voices. Now, I did quote it at the beginning. If you heard that, the amplify and celebrate. And I like those kind of descriptions instead of just an education and explanation. It's amplifying and celebrating. Why those words? Why that perspective?
I think this is so critical when I think about healing, recovery, self-awareness. We love to medicalize it. I mean, and by medicalize, I mean, it's like it's serious business. And it is, because we're talking about addiction and we're talking about, life and death subjects. But a huge part of what draws us into the door can be the promise of joy, of expansion.
Yes.
Of life getting bigger.
Yes.
Seeing what someone has over there and being like, oh my gosh, that's one of my goals. I want that. There's this idea of almost uncomplicated. I don't know if pleasure is the right word, but that is something that seems like we put at odds with recovery. Recovery is hard work. Recovery is about sickness. Recovery is about, and all those things could be true inside of a worldview. There's still room, at least for me, that I can consider my alcoholism like a disease, and I can still leave all this room for recovery as a joyful, exciting, celebratory experience.
Yeah, that part of your recovery can be good music and beautiful art and going to places that make you feel really special. I mean, those things add to recovery and really, in my view, are part of my recovery. It's not just following a program or subscribing to education, or in Smart's case, doing practical exercises. It's so much more. And we talk about it, Smart. We talk about a life beyond addiction, healthy, fulfilling, and balanced. So that is certainly a great key to, I think, long-term recovery. Because you can't just, be, down in the dumps, but saying, well, I'm not using, so life is grand. AA actually talks about, we are not a glum lot. And I love that phrase because really it's speaking to exactly what you're saying, that joyfulness, that affirmation of the world around us, not just a kind of a negation and what I can't do. So that's a very good point. Speaking of Smart, where did you discover Smart along your journey?
Absolutely. I think my first encounter with Smart in a real way, right, was in the process of building the, I think, second Sober Voices event. We knew we wanted to partner with organizations that deeply believed in multiple pathways, whether they were representing one of those pathways, combining pathways just by the nature of what they did. And Smart checked every box in that way. I think that, the idea, one of the ideas for Sober Voices is we're providing tools without an agenda on which tools and how to use them, but it is sort of like laying them out at anyone who attends feet. Here's someone using meditation, someone using CBT, someone using journaling, like all of these different experiences from our speakers. They're often speaking about tools. And when we met Mike Cooper, because we had heard great things about Smart, we were like, oh, this is a really powerful toolkit.
Mm-hmm. Mike Cooper, for those who may not know, is a Smart employee who's a regional director now for some of the southern states, where he does outreach and does all kinds of education. So about Smart.
And it was amazing, what we were able to do in discovering Smart as, sort of a modality for, continued growth, continued healing, was that we got to hear Mike's story. When he came onto the Sober Voices platform, he didn't do a lecture on, how Smart works. he shared his own experience as a veteran, as, as a human being going on this whole journey, and then actually tying in, how certain tools in SMART worked for him. And so what I love about that model is like people got introduced to SMART through our event, but in a way that actually centered it on Mike's personal experience. And then anyone who attended, anyone who listened had an opportunity to go experience SMART, on their own and have their own experience with it.
Right.
So I'm really excited about this idea of more organizations, more institutions that have that level of openness to telling their story through human narrative, not just from the I don't know. What's everyone saying? Evidence-backed.
Didactic, lecture, intellectual.
Scientific, just only scientific, right?
Now saying at the same time, there are tools that are science-based, and there's research done. But that's just part of how a person can change their story. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, asks us to question some of our assumptions, some of the ways we talk to ourselves, and that can actually change a story. Is that fair to say that tools, maybe not just SMART, but can change the way we deal with our own thoughts and feelings and behaviors?
Absolutely. And I think alongside changing our narratives when we have a lot of support and community. Like, I think the second part is it can feel really destabilizing or nerve-wracking to have, a way I've thought about something be challenged. But when it's in a setting that's community-based, discussion-based, contemplation or meditation-based, it gets really safe to be like, wow, that really isn't true, this thing I've been saying about myself or my life. Or the way I've held this idea or this substance, I wonder if this could be different. I just feel like that curiosity and that flexibility comes when I know I'm surrounded by people. And that's what we also thought was so interesting about SMART. It was all about community, the meetings, right? Having people together.
That's right. The mutual support. And there's lots of research done about, people who are exposed to mutual support meetings while in treatment have better outcomes once they leave treatment. That it isn't just that educational piece. It's experiencing other people who are going through similar things. And as you talk about in Sober Voices, all voices and all experiences on the journey.
Absolutely.
So tell me, as we kind of head toward the end of this conversation, what are the best things about Sober Voices and Sourcing Voices?
I mean, for us, it has absolutely been the community that's rallied around. Right now, our top focus is Sourcing Voices. We have a really ambitious goal in 2023 to make our platform with all the stories and speaker content available to 100,000 or more undergraduates. And we just chose that demographic because it is representative of a cohort of young people who are probably, if I remember correctly, surrounded by substances of all sorts.
There's no doubt. There's no doubt. I mean, I have a son who's in college, and it's true. There's just all kinds of emphasis on substances and kind of as part of your social life.
Right. And, when we thought about creating this library, we said, well, like, who would have the most immediate benefit? And to us, like, yes, someone in that high pressured situation where they're trying to negotiate their relationship. It doesn't even need to be a crisis moment. It's just like, who do I want to be with this thing that is beer or that is, XYZ substance? Who do I want to be with it? Having a library they can return to as part of the wellness offering of their campus just made a lot of sense to us. And we've had some incredible partners so far, like UC Berkeley, who have been able to kind of bring this platform onto their campus, have it be used as a toolkit for peer health educators, for undergrads who are questioning their relationship with substances. And I think the vision we have is over time, could we apply this library to professionals who are supporting folks? Particularly young folks, but also first generation, disabled, LGBTQ, neurodiverse, BIPOC, like all of these like kind of cohorts that really deserve, I think, more empathy, more understanding from the support community.
Yeah.
And so the second dream, 2024 maybe, or maybe 2023, is to bring this to hospitals, nursing, and other teaching institutions, like for therapy and counseling, so that we just get more and more folks to better understand the complexity and the nuance of the stories and experiences that young people are having, but that I think people are having generally, really related to their identities, whether it's age, race. I mean, there are so many different aspects of who we are that inform our recovery.
Right. We're complex individuals for sure. And I like this idea of introducing it to those who are establishing careers, maybe in medicine or therapy or any kind of allied health profession, because they may not know that there are multiple pathways, and they may not know that there are places that people, no matter what kind of background they have, can relate to, other people of similar kind of stories. There's the story again. It is all about stories, and I think that it's so much the power of story that can help in recovery journey. Is that true?
Yeah. Absolutely. I live in Boston, in the heart of where all the world's best hospitals are. I'm a stone's throw from Children's, Brigham and Women's, Harvard Medical School. And I will tell you that those individuals, those students, those residents often have one slice of an experience with folks who are in recovery, which is that they attend one 12-step meeting that is in the curriculum. And I can tell you, as someone who has been in those meetings, when these very well-intentioned professionals come in to, lend an ear and try to get to understand, at the end, when I ask them, what did you get from that? Almost every single person says, well, that wasn't what I expected. There is so much bias around who we think someone is when we think of the word addiction or addict or alcoholic or substance abuse, substance use. All of these carry these connotations and these stereotypes. And if the world's best physicians and doctors and nurses are really thinking to themselves like, oh, this is really different than what I thought, I wonder what it's going to be like if we can get them access to something like a Sourcing Voices platform, and they can hear even more stories that break through.
I'll tell you, that exposure is so important. And you're right. If someone has a preconception of what a recovery meeting is or what an approach to recovery is, they need to have that smashed. They need to have that challenged and made out to be or revealed to be just one aspect, just one pathway. That is, I think, key. And, it's smart. We don't use terms like addict and alcoholic because it tends to define a person in a narrow way, as opposed to a person with a substance use disorder or someone who's struggling with a kind of behavior. And, and that seems to be more about meeting people where they are, not putting them in boxes.
Absolutely. Anna Lemke's book really talks about like the journey with anything related to substances as indicative of the human condition. It's got exaggerated circumstances, life and death, right? But all human brains actually experience, probably to smaller degrees with things like chocolate or that popcorn they're eating during the movie, this experience of the craving and the idea of that loop in the brain. So if we were able to actually transform the way we thought about recovery, but also how we think about this idea of addiction or substance use disorders to be just a version of the human experience that is much exaggerated in the sense of consequence, we wouldn't be able to separate. And by we, I mean folks who don't live with this as their reality wouldn't be able to separate themselves as far, I think, from those who are living and healing from any sort of painful substance relationship.
Oh, that's such a great point. Such a great point. That's Mercy Bell. She is a co-owner of Sober Voices, and she's also involved with Sourcing Voices. And she's explained about those two things and their relationship, and the fact that Sober Voices can be in moments in time, while Sourcing Voices, because it's digitally based, can be something that's around for a long, long time. Mercy, anything that you'd like to say that we haven't covered yet today?
Well, if I can, I want to thank you, Luke, for bringing me on here, and also thank Smart, who have been just such incredible partners. And you can find a lot of great Smart content inside of Sourcing Voices. And for anyone who's listening, who would, like to preview the platform, we definitely want to be available, because it's creating a lot of opportunities for us to have a new dialogue and a new discussion on all things recovery.
Excellent. That's Mercy Bell. You've been listening to the Smart Recovery Podcast. Mercy, thank you so much for coming on. I not only learned a lot, I felt a lot. I felt of the things you were talking about story and people's experiences and this idea of amplifying and celebrating. So thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Luke.
This is the Smart Recovery Podcast. I'm Luke Frazier. Until next time, stay healthy and stay connected.